Hi, everyone. Welcome to what I believe is the last session of today, the Messy Outlook for Mobility as a Service. This session is sponsored by the Urban Tech Hub, which is a new venture in New York City based at the Jacobs Technion and Cornell Institute, which is part of Cornell Tech. The Urban Tech Hub generates applied research, fosters an expanding tech ecosystem, and cultivates the next generation of leaders in urban technology. Our goal is to shape the field of urban tech with a human-centered approach that focuses first on people that use technology. This workshop's the second of 3 events that we've organized as part of the 2021 Cornell Tech Mobility Roundtable. And our goal for the year has really been to frame a series of conversations around what we're calling digital mobility marketplaces. These are the structures that enable consumers to discover, plan, and book their transportation services. Our first event back in March looked at the special role of automated vehicles, and now we're turning to the more immediate future of mobility as a service, or MaaS, as it exists today. I want to hand over the floor to Andrew Salzberg, who's going to take you through the hour. But before I do, I just want to thank Andrew for bringing together such an interesting group of people who are doing such cool work. And of course, thank all of our participants for sharing their time and their insights with us today. So Andrew, take it away.
Great, thanks Anthony, and great to be here. So I'm going to try and share my screen, do a very short presentation just to give kind of a lay of the land. So that's working. Let me see if I can get this into present mode. Always good to know. Okay. So I think what I want to talk about a little bit is what Anthony just alluded to. So mobility as a service. I think for those of you in the room, and if you're at this conference, I think it's something you've been hearing about for the last many years. And I picked this image because it's kind of the most generic stock image of what this magical mobility as a service future might look like, right? Everything at the touch of a finger, it's going to be easy and seamless. So much so that it's going to fade into the clip art collective consciousness of our society, right? But I think if you've been watching the space and paying attention to it, I think it's fair to say there's been a certain degree of disappointment with the concept, despite the level of hype that we've heard about it. So it's not all disappointment. I want to toot the horn of one of the companies I work for, which is Transit right here in Montreal, and say there are pieces of this vision that are coming true, thanks to some of the partners on this call we're going to get into in detail. But where I'm sitting, I can, in fact, unlock a bike share bike and buy a bus ticket through Transit app in Montreal. So there's places where some of that mobility as a service vision we're talking about, where all modes of transportation work together and they're easy to access and you can buy them without thinking about it. Small pieces of that are happening. But I would say overwhelmingly what we're seeing, at least from my point of view, is relatively disappointing results. So on the one hand, I think we've seen a lot of hype around white label apps that were built to be kind of the all-in-one place to go. So one prominent example, and this is not to pick on LA unfairly, there's lots of places that have pursued this vision, apps that are built by parties like Xerox on behalf of public agencies that are, hyped originally as kind of the place that's going to be the one-stop shop for mobility in your city. And I think overwhelmingly, certainly North America, the results of those have been underwhelming, I think. So I tried to find the stories about the end of this app, which was ultimately shut down. And despite my best Googling attempts, I couldn't find any news about the end of it. But the official site for this app, ends up in this sort of blank, GoDaddy, we're holding on to this for you now message, which I think is sort of a summation to some extent of some of the white label experience around MaaS apps in North America at the very least. So that's one branch, I think, of the MaaS tree of disappointment. And I think the other one is different, in that there are many companies that are doing different forms of mobility services, but increasingly, I think, viewing their long-term market as dominating different pieces of the mobility system and owning the parts that they refer to, and creating what people have referred to as walled gardens in the software world. So you may control a certain piece of the mobility ecosystem, and you want people to access it through the platforms that you control and not anywhere else. So not to pick on just Lyft, there's lots of examples you can find, but to give an example, I think really brings home the point. The bike share system in New York, which is one of the largest in the world and certainly the biggest in North America, was run by a company called Motivate, which was acquired by Lyft. And after that, Lyft made the choices to make access for third-party apps to the bike share system more difficult. So I think this is just one example in a prominent location of a lot of business impulses to control as much of the mobility ecosystem as you can and not necessarily play nice and work together on different aspects of mobility. So that's kind of trends that I'm seeing. And I want to point out a kind of parallel example to give a potential vision of the different futures we might see in mobility. And I can draw from communication here and just take 2 big picture pathways we might pursue in mobility. And one of them is around email. So email, what could be more boring than email, but it kind of magically works in a pretty compelling way that you and I can interact by email without having the same email client and having no idea that if I send you a message at Gmail and I'm from Yahoo or a corporate account, it gets to you. And that's all because way back in the 1970s, there was a data standard established for email that still works today. And so no one company controls that, and interoperability is the norm. If you compare that with Messenger, a Facebook product, if you want to send a message to someone on Facebook Messenger, you have to download Facebook Messenger, whether you feel like it or not. And I think that's the model that, frankly, if I had to bet on, more of the money and the investment and the big picture desire is to build Messenger-like visions of the future more than email, where I think email is kind of the unsexy but pretty effective model we might pursue for mobility. And so one of the things I want to say that's not quite as depressing is I think on one hand, you could point to a lot of trends that are pushing against interoperability. There are some really good examples, and I want to do one quickly before I get to our amazing panel. And so this is not the first time we've talked about mobility data standards within the mobility world. And Gtfs is a really great example to build on. So if you don't know what Gtfs is, it's the data standard by which public transport agencies publish their schedule information to apps like Google Maps or Apple or Transit or elsewhere. And it works magically well. Basically every large agency in North America has a Gtfs feed. You don't even have to know what that is. You just know that when you open Google Maps or any other app, you get your directions. And that happens really seamlessly. And that's all built on an open data standard that people can collaborate on and adopt in their own way. And that's pretty fantastic. And I think one thing that's worth remembering is that while we take that to be so obvious and so uneventful today, 10 years ago, that was kind of controversial. This is an example from the MTA fighting app developers from using their schedule information. That's a little over 10 years ago. And so this has all been turned on its head. And today the MTA takes it for granted that they freely release schedule information for app developers to use. So we have a really good example of an open data standard in mobility that's being widely adopted, even though at first there was some resistance to that system. And so I think my framing for this question of mobility that's gotten more complicated, we have more modes of transport than we did 10 years ago, can we repeat the success of what Gtfs did? Can we kind of establish email-like foundations for the future of mobility? That's how I want to frame the question for today. But what's exciting about this is we have a really great panel to talk about these things. So Anthony and I are your co-hosts for this conversation. But we've got Josh Andrews, the COO and co-founder of Spare. We've got Heidi Gennon, the director of shared mobility product at Mobility Data. We've got Katie Monroe, partnerships at Transit, and we've got Pamita Ferra from Token Transit. So it's an amazing panel, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can make that work. Stop sharing that, and I'm going to turn over the questions. And the first thing I want to ask to everyone on the panel, and we'll just go through in turn. I think we have essentially kind of stacked the deck, I would say, on this panel with companies or organizations that have some belief in a slightly more interoperable vision of the future of mobility, which I would characterize, you guys can disagree, as sort of the underdog position of how the future might evolve. Feel free to disagree. So I want to go through and have you guys talk about in turn, how is it that your company or your organization is building product or whatever it is you're building in a way that supports a more interoperable and open MaaS ecosystem. And I think we were going to start with Pami. So why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. So Token Transit's mission is to build transportation through a city-powered open marketplace for transit. So by city-powered, we mean that we're procured by governments. We give power and control to governments to manage payments for transportation. And then open marketplace means we work with any provider for all transportation, whether that's public transit or even bike share, ride share. So giving cities more levers to expand the scope of transportation beyond public buses and trains to act as the mobility managers for their cities. So our marketplace connects aggregators like our partner on the call here, Transit app, as well as Move It, Google Maps on one side with providers, public transit, bike share, ride share on the other side. And in the center, the city provides the subsidies and the regulatory access that are very important for a city to control, all on a single unified platform. The fundamental values that define our product is that we focus on letting people pay for transit. We have a shared platform for all transit agencies. We build tools for agencies to help themselves, and we're available everywhere, accepted everywhere.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for being succinct. That was good, to the point. Okay, let's go to Heidi. Tell us about mobility data.
Sure. Mobility Data is a Montreal-based nonprofit. We work internationally. We've got staff in 4 countries. And we kind of work in the scenes behind the scenes. So some of the folks in this panel are members of our organization and benefit from the standardization that we do. They kind of make the most of what we do to improve experiences for their clients and for the public. We accelerate the development and the adoption of mobility specifications such as Gtfs, which Andrew already mentioned, and including some of the real-time extension for that. And then the general bike share feed specification, which also covers scooters and mopeds and cars. And we provide sort of the technical know-how and the tools and create new specifications, improve existing ones, host trainings, and develop working groups in response to the mobility industry's needs. This question about kind of how we support an open MaaS ecosystem, our standards are open standards. And what I mean by that is they are available on the open internet for free with permissive licenses. And the standards that we govern are designed to support open data as well. So the data created in those standards is intended and designed to be not so sensitive that it cannot be shared publicly without authentication. As we add more and more information that might become more sensitive over time as you put it together, we're looking at those options, but it's super important to us to maintain as much as we can publicly available and open, because for us, I mean, that's where the value really comes in, making sure travelers have lots of options. Sorry, couldn't prevent that one. So in addition to being open in that sense, we also, we govern them openly. So they are governed in public, out loud, everyone can see what's happening. It's a consensus process, and we include the data producers and the data consumers, which is really important to us because it makes us have a pragmatic and implementable data standard that is vetted. And so this is like the backbone of being able to discover service. And the last thing I'll say, and kind of forgive this public health metaphor, that's like part of my background, is we just provide wraparound services. So we help create the data specifications and improve them and clarify them, but we also build the tools and the resources that improve data quality, and they make it easier for the mobility stakeholders to adopt those specifications and enforce them and kind of know that they're getting the data that they want. So I'll cut it there.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Okay, Katie.
Yeah, so I'll keep my thoughts brief since Andrew shared a little bit about what we're working on at Transit, but I'm on the partnerships team at Transit and have been here for a few years and tend to work on a lot of our multimodal integration. So the work that I do touches microtransit, working closely with folks like Spare, it touches mobile ticketing, it touches lots of bikes and scooter stuff, and also all the cool new things happening in Gtfs as well. Just to dig in a little more, types of things that I'm doing in my day-to-day that sort of encapsulate how we're working towards a more open and interoperable system. I work on building integrations with microtransit partners like Spare, and also talk to agencies and work in collaboration with mobility data and lots of other entities on how we can better standardize the types of data feeds that we use to build those integrations with microtransit. I also talk to cities and micromobility operators about the importance of making Gbfs data public and available, and run around trying to track down those feeds. Very thankful for the work the mobility data does on that front as well to track down those feeds. But essentially the work that I'm doing is to both take the data that's already out there and make sure it gets into our app for users to be able to find and use these modes of transportation, but also trying to advance the conversation with Andrew and others on how we can make that work easier to do and make it more possible that more people can access this information.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Last but not least, Josh, we'll talk about Spare.
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks for putting this all together. My name's Josh. I'm one of the co-founders and chief operating officer at Spare. And we're really essentially, we view ourselves as an operating system for mobility providers with a mission to really empower everyone to unlock this massive potential that we see with mobility and mobility services around the world. So we're a global company. We operate across North America, Europe, and Japan. And essentially what this looks like on the ground is we empower public transit agencies, for instance, to run incredible paratransit services and on-demand microtransit services for their customers, and make that the best experience they possibly can bring to the end user. And we also work with even all the way down to a ridehail type of provider, where we'll enable them to bring incredible on-demand experiences on a more private side to the world, and be independent in doing so. One, I guess, unique thing is when we started back in 2015, the business, we decided to really be quite open as a business, and we actually deployed our entire API as basically like an open API on the internet, available to everyone. And that was really to really push the mission to build something that reduces basically all barriers to entry for people that are looking to launch a service. And that's really what motivates us every day, is how can we continue to reduce those barriers, both for our own customers, so the people that are operating the service, but also their customers, people that are trying to take a service and trying to get on a service. So we really think that whether or not you're taking a conventional transit bus, or if you're taking a paratransit service, those should be accessible in whatever interface you choose, whatever is already on your phone, for instance, or however you need to use it. And we don't want to be the barrier for that. So it's a bit about Spare, but thanks for putting this all together.
Great. And I can try and push everybody a little bit, because I think I mentioned in the opening that I kind of view the world that I'm describing, a world where services are interoperable and they communicate with open data standards that organizations like Heidi's are building, as the underdog position. And I used to work at Uber. For those who don't know, when I was there, one of the big launches of how the service was branded was that it wanted to be the Amazon of transportation, which I think in hindsight is a little bit funny. But I think Amazon wants to be the everything store, wants to be the all-conquering force in many different domains, not just online retail. And so, do you guys disagree that the kind of vision of working together is the underdog position? And is it going to be the typical underdogs usually lose, right? That's why we like when underdogs win. So is this whole happy story going to come to a crashing halt when someone manages to wrestle all the pieces of the mobility world into one magical Amazon-like service? That's for anybody who wants to weigh in. Disagree with me, agree with me, paint the vision the other way. It's like class. I'll call on somebody if no one wants to take a stab.
I think that
Thank you, Heidi.
At a minimum, yeah, Andrew. Well, I feel like I have to chime in. I became a hockey fan last year, and the Habs made it into the next round of the playoffs. And as a result, I feel like I can defend this underdog position. I think at a minimum, what will prevent that from happening is the inability of many very nearby government agencies from agreeing on what they allow and permit and ask for, quite frankly. We work kind of across the globe, and I live in North America. It's very easy, I think, from a US or a Canadian perspective to think of our very large countries and how we do things quite similarly across the states and provinces. But when we are doing our work in Europe, it becomes very clear that even just the work of getting standardization agreed upon is very, very difficult, and how the authority comes down to cities and regions from the national governments is very different. And so I think that there are, at a minimum, we may have several giant aggregators, like giant organizations, but I don't think there will be just one. I don't think we risk that at a minimum. And I do think that there is an increasing understanding. I think we are going to benefit from some of what happened during the quick attempt to build out very data heavy and privacy concerning applications during the pandemic. I think we may find that a lot of folks who were part of those groups who tried to kind of create something from the ground up without having those really tough consensus conversations may end up benefiting some of these other industries, including ours.
So government procurement differences will keep us from a takeover. Is that it? Anthony, you're going to weigh in. Sorry.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to just back up a little bit and see if we could tease out like some of what particularly what Token Transit and Spare have learned from openness, right? I mean, if there's one thing we learn about open data, it's that the users always surprise us. And I'm curious what surprising uses, who's connected to your platforms that you didn't expect to perform, that demonstrate some of the value of this. It's open for anybody to answer, but thought I'd start with you too.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that from our perspective, when we took this approach a number of years ago, I'll be completely honest, we were kind of thinking it was maybe a bad idea. It was like, oh, let's make our API public, everybody can see it, competition too. But pretty strongly believe that the world to not just be this walled garden or provide this really great experience, but nobody else can access it. And so we went for it, and that's kind of, I guess, the rest is history there. What we've seen from then on, though, is that roughly 70 to 80% of our customers utilize our open API in some form. So the vast majority of people are using it. And I think at this point, over 30% of our trips that we perform on the platform. So this is, microtransit trips, paratransit trips, ridehail trips, even down to airport shuttle types of trips. All of these trips, 30% of them originate in a third-party interface that's not provided by us. And that's a number that we see actually kind of trending upwards. So I think that for the most part, we're actually seeing a pretty broad adoption and a surprising amount of adoption for this type of model. And yeah, something that we continue to try to push and yeah, get more out there in the world.
Yeah, we're at Token Transit observing similar to what Josh said, where because our app is super simple just for payments with transit, whereas with our partner apps, we're powering payments, but in like Transit app, for example, the user gets the entire experience of planning and paying all in one place. And we're seeing over time, especially as riders become more aware of their choices to, say choose Transit app or any of these other apps that we power payments in, that they increasingly use those apps more than they would initially use Token Transit. And to Andrew and Heidi's point on where, how Token Transit is vulnerable there, or all of these players are vulnerable, it really does come down to the procurement process, right? Governments want a specific thing, and even though a siloed custom solution looks really attractive in the here and now, that is a snapshot of the rider needs, or how the agency understands rider needs at that point in time, and it will grow still quickly. But the vendors or partners who are offering interoperable solutions are somewhat vulnerable in that procurement process, because in order to be interoperable, it has to be scalable. And that means, you're not building your own Facebook Messenger. You're, agreeing to work with an email client where you're not going to get to define those very specific features, right? That you may want upfront, but you're buying into this like interoperable space. And I think where we're vulnerable is in the way that the RFPs really drive those requirements and fund, candidly, that's that scale.
Yeah, I feel like the government procurement has come up several times. That's where all good panel conversations go to die, right? Talking about government procurement. But I think it does seem relevant in this case. And I had this as one of my questions, but you kind of pushed it to the front of the table, I feel like, in a couple of circumstances. So, how do you just outlined it, right? In my GoLA example, obviously, to your point, it seems like conceptually it's simple for government agencies when they think about MaaS to want to buy a whole solution you can point to and essentially do like a virtual ribbon cutting. I think, supporting something like Token that maybe you don't even know you're using potentially in the background of another app is less exciting. And Josh, to your point, if I'm accessing Spare somewhere else, I might not even be fully aware of how I'm doing that. So, is there a world in which, and maybe this is Heidi for you, and how can data standards help on this question, but how do we think about procuring from a government perspective? And that's not the only role governments have, but from a procurement perspective, how do we get more of the stuff that we want to happen?
Well, one thing, when I was thinking about this question, there's this, the really simple really simple answer is getting governments to ask for the data and ask for it to be publicly available and ask for open APIs and require those things. And there's several pieces to that are challenging that we're trying to do some of on mobility data side. We'll be releasing a guide soon that, thank you, Andrew, was one of the reviewers for it, telling cities, here's how to ask for Gbfs. Because what we've learned is a lot of times they literally just want copy and paste language, and they will copy from each other because they have a lot of other stuff they're trying to do. It's not that they can't grok this, it's that it's not the highest priority. So part of it is we have to do our jobs. We have to do a lot more outreach and education and making really easily understandable collateral, making sample language. That has been a big learning curve for us that we have really focused on this last year. Because what happens is a lot of times, sometimes there's an example in one of the big cities in Europe of just requiring operators to integrate with 2 MaaS platforms. That's the requirement. So for an operator who would prefer to have the kind of walled garden that we were talking about, they have a perverse incentive to make sure that their integration with those operators sucks, right? Like that's what they want, because they would prefer the riders to come to their app. And that's understandable from an operator perspective. But if what the city really wants is MaaS integration, then what they should ask for is the data in an open, standardized way that all of the MaaS integrators can access. And then we're not even suggesting that that means one MaaS integrator rises as the best, but one MaaS integrator rises as the best for me and for you and for different travelers with different needs. And they're all having access to the same data. And so that's, for me, I think that's the first thing. And I do think that we have had to have so many conversations with partners about why 1 million experimental fields, because their city is a little different, actually really harms what their traveling public gets. And we have found kind of maybe a little, this was a little surprising to me at first, that even though the cities are the ones who are going to require it, we need them to require the data in their procurement. It's actually often the transit agencies who don't have the power to require the information who are the ones who are going to make the most use of it, because they're really trying to be the ones who are that kind of multimodal integrator in their regions.
Yeah, I was going to speak to that a little bit, and just in terms of like, I'm spending a lot of time reading through procurement from both cities and transit agencies procurement documents talking about mobile ticketing, microtransit, micromobility, all of these different things, with an eye obviously from transit's perspective to like what are the requirements around integration and multimodal stuff. And to Heidi's point about sometimes there's 2 different entities that would be using the data or like have different interests in it or different investments in it. But I think some of where I've already seen some of these requirements start to happen, some of the like lowest hanging fruit where it's already happening are like a transit agency that has an on-demand microtransit program, and it's very intuitive that they want to make sure that riders can plan trips that connect on demand to fixed route. And so some of the work that we've done with Spare is building those types of integrations where the trip planning can happen in our app. We already have the fixed route because of great Gtfs data, and we're plugging in that on demand so people can connect the dots. That, I think is a pretty immediate need we're seeing from a lot of transit agencies, and both the fixed route and the on demand is sort of under their purview. And on the micromobility side, I do think it gets, transit agencies in particular, whether in the US or in Europe, that have a particular interest in micromobility, either because the bike share system is actually run by the transit agency, or they're just really thinking in a very multimodal way about what they're serving. Those are the transit agencies that are the most interested in making sure this data is public to connect. Some cities are thinking about how they're working with their public transit when they're thinking about micromobility. Some cities are not thinking about it as much. So sometimes it makes it in to the procurement or permitting, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think there are places where this is already happening that we just need to build on to see that broader vision of like whether or not this other mode of transportation is directly under your purview. If you want people to be able to connect the dots and use everything to get around, then these types of requirements have to be coming wherever they can come, and the data has to be made public, whatever its source is.
Josh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add one thing. I mean, while I do love requirements that are put in RFPs, I think that's a very valid point that, you know, we want people asking for the right things. I think it's also just like when I speak with agencies and, you know, public agencies around the world, I often you know, ask them like how easy would it be to swap out your vendor? So if you have this vendor, like what would it like? What if they aren't performing, or what if the interface is, you know, getting old, or they're not doing a good job anymore? Would it be easy to swap them out? And if that's, you know, if that's a no, or they become terrified by that concept, then there's maybe a problem there. And I think that's, you know, that's a good rule of thumb when writing an RFP, is that, like, you know, you're going in there and you're saying, okay, well, if Spare is in transit app, and, you know, that's a nice integration point, but, you know, Spare is not cutting it, then we need to be able to figure out another way to get this going. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that that's where we're competitive, and that's where we want to be competitive, and why we'll win in that space is because we're going to continue to provide that great experience, but not because we're going to lock people into a walled garden.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the hope. I think, you know, one of the underlying premises of this whole thing, at least for me, is that if you make it easier to swap the parts out, then maybe you'll get things that actually work better for users in the end. I think that's kind of the dream scenario here. And some of the bad interfaces that we end up with are people who are, you know, using software systems that are hard to replace for one reason or another, and just sort of deeply embedded in something that they become comfortable over time. So I'm going to grab it. There's actually a couple questions in the Q&A from people, which I'm going to take one from there, from Nico Larco, who many of you probably know. But I think, you know, one of the things that he mentions, which I think is a good point to take on, you know, I talked about, because I used to work at Uber, and I mentioned the Lyft example. I think, you know, what some of the stuff that I was talking about is potentially, you know, the new dominant force in mobility. I was talking about from the operator side growing over time. Maybe the more obvious elephant in the room, as Nico points out, is Google Maps, just in terms of the number of users and the sort of dominant position that it's in. And obviously, I think increasingly we're finding some examples of Google, you know, integrating Waymo most recently, but also some places in finding ways to, you know, have parking unlock services and transit ticketing in certain cases, all of which, you know, in many ways is good. But I think Google, you could paint the picture from the other way. You know, I'm sitting with transit right now, and so we're talking about knitting things together is good, but you can imagine platforms acquiring a lot of power in that direction as well. So, you know, is Google Maps kind of the elephant in the room? And more broadly, should we be more worried about, you know, platforms gaining, you know, too much control over operators? Josh, maybe that's a more sympathetic frame for you guys as well. I don't know who wants to take that position of Google and generally, you know, someone large growing from that perspective.
I think this is a place where we might see Europe have a much bigger impact in terms of the anti-competition laws, and who has a pathway to integration and who does not, and how that integration happens in the major trip planning applications. I haven't seen a lot of that in North America, but I've seen those conversations in Europe. And I think that we may find some more pressure, at least to create a clearer pathway for integration. And if that clearer pathway for integration is created, and it's created in a standardized way, then that's also going to open up that data being created for some of the smaller players to have access to it too. And I don't want to say I have a ton of hope, but I think that's one path I see.
I personally love this question, Nico, so thanks for that. I think, you know, when I look at most cities around the world for that, you know, that provide specialized transit services, or paratransit services, as it's called in the US, if you want to take a trip from point A to point B, you go into Google Maps, and you know, your conventional transit user, you'll get all your directions to figure out how to get there. If you're a specialized transit user, you're not going to get any help, to be honest. And that's I think a pretty sad state of the current world when it comes to these kind of integrators platforms. And I think, you know, when it's not just Google Maps, it's really every platform out there. But I think that when you look at the demographics and the people that's affecting, it's pretty incredible that that's still not the case. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So I think there's, you know, as we talk about these open standards, there's also quite an onus on the I mean, as Nico here mentions, on the integrators to maybe either not become too powerful or to be you know, nudged in the right direction to make sure that these services are, you know, not just the conventional transit services, but every service that's provided by a city is available through those interfaces. I think that's an important step that we'll have to take in the future here. And to be honest, kind of surprised that we're still not quite there yet. But maybe Transit app has some ideas around that.
Well, I think this is probably a good moment to talk about sort of the Gofs development and what's at sort of the forefront of what we're talking about here, the types of integrations that Transit has done with microtransit, not as of yet paratransit services yet, although it's something we're talking about a lot right now, have all been based on partners having APIs that are similar to each other, but not identical. And it's, custom work with each partner that we're excited to do and excited to work with everybody to get as many of those services in the app as possible. But having a data standard that standardizes the way that all of those types of integrations look would have a huge impact on our ability to scale. And the work that Mobility Data is leading in partnership with lots of public and private folks to talk about microtransit, paratransit, all of these types of on-demand services, and make sure there's a way, in a standardized way, to get them into apps like ours would be a big help on that front. Because I totally agree with you, Josh. You should be able to open any of these apps and see all of the options.
And I think one of the things that I would chime in on that with is I have in the past did non-emergency medical transportation work. And I think, when we talk about Gofs, we talk about paratransit and microtransit. I think we talk about the holy grail of MaaS, but I think even beyond that, if we actually had a standardized way and open APIs to communicate between the non-emergency medical transportation system and the existing fleets that are there to serve the public that are not specialized in terms of eligibility, and there was actually a sharing of fleets and those resources. I mean, when a lot of the ride hail companies came into towns and towns required that they have a certain amount of accessible vehicles available, those are probably getting underutilized in many ways when there's a ton of demand still for non-emergency medical transportation that's accessible. So I think if we can actually pin down the right data standards and open APIs, we go beyond just I think what folks normally think of for MaaS, and we actually have the potential to benefit a lot of different travelers and communities that maybe aren't part of how we conceptualize it often. And someone asked in the chat, is there a Gtfs, Gbfs type of data standard being developed for the microtransit services? And that's what Katie just referred to, Gofs, the general on-demand feed specification. And that is under development right now at Mobility Data, but as Katie mentioned, with a whole bunch of private and public partners who are working on that and borrowing from existing specifications like Gtfs Flex, which already represents on-demand transit.
I know it says anonymous, but I promise I didn't ask that question just to have you give that answer, Heidi. But it did come in at a timely time. There's a lot of good questions in the chat, which is great. Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to push on a little bit. I think I presented up top data standards as a possible answer. Obviously, Heidi, you're deep in the weeds there at Mobility Data on data standards, and Josh, you guys have put out your own API and made it open and accessible for people to use. And I think there's a lot of work happening in transit and consuming data in different standards and formats. I think, for anyone who, you kind of alluded to this, Heidi, at the top about the process by which you develop these standards, but I think it's fair to say, data standards doesn't sound like the most fast-moving, exciting process, right? I know that there are lots of companies who are in the space who are smaller, they're startups, they want to move quickly, they want to build things and scale. And the idea of getting involved in a collaborative, group that has to agree on something and take time and publish and review sounds painful. So how do we make that process feel inviting to people? Is it as painful as I'm describing? And that can be for you, Heidi, but obviously I think all of us in some capacity have touched these standards. So does somebody want to weigh in on, is it difficult? How do we make it easier? What's working, what's not in the creation of data standards?
Well, I think it depends on if you want a standard or you want an outcome. So, I mean, I guess that sounds maybe a little sassy, but there are other standards out there. There's a lot of them that aren't developed with a consensus model. They aren't developed with data producers in the room. They are not developed to be implementable. And then they don't scale. So if you want to scale, then you should probably be part of the process that makes sure that everything has been vetted and there's a huge ecosystem to support you. I mean, how many times somebody in this room has referred to the work they're doing with somebody else? That's part of the beauty of it, is that we are an ecosystem that supports each other, and that allows us to move quickly, but get out as quickly as we can at the speed of trust, which means that we get outcomes. And I don't know, I guess that's my kindergarten teacher way of saying that, but maybe somebody else has a more compelling argument.
I was just going to chime in with, a great example of something moving really quickly that is building on an existing standard, not building something from scratch, but just looking at the past year and a half and the way that, a little bit of the Gtfs standard about crowding that no one was really paying attention to, all of a sudden became really central to a lot of trip planning and a lot of things that agencies were thinking about. And there was a community there to move quickly of, making tweaks and adjustments to make sure that the standard was reflecting, the types of information that agencies wanted to get to riders during a pandemic about how crowded the bus was. And that information got into apps within, a matter of weeks, couple months after the start of the pandemic, not protracted years later. So when it just kind of speaks to, while there can be, longer trust building processes, once you build them, then you have something that can actually be quite flexible and responsive in times of crisis, but also just in general. But that was something that, I feel like I learned by watching it in the past year and really impressed me.
Great. I'm going to take a couple more questions from the Q&A, unless Anthony, you want to weigh in, but I'll.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump on that point and ask whether, is there a role for government to take advantage of that and sort of create some artificial crises to try to advance some policy goals in the right direction? It's a really fascinating example, but it's something that may need to be directed to get to where we want to go.
I would be curious to hear more about what you're thinking about manufacturing artificial crises.
Well, I guess I'm thinking, could you mobilize that same kind of energy around a challenge? And how would you incentivize and motivate, the ecosystem to produce something, some update to the standard or some other, functionality that might be able to help push through some of the roadblocks?
I think one of the things that happened with the crowding is that it was coming from the folks who produce the data and the folks who consume the data, because travelers wanted the data. So I think if you could think of an example of that, where it's not just cities trying to push their own goals but it is really kind of coming from what the public is asking for. We've been trying to push, like we're representing adaptive vehicle fleets in Gbfs, and I will say we have not gotten a whole lot of support from the folks who would have to require that data. So it's for all kinds of reasons, right? Similar to non-emergency medical transportation, those ones are more expensive, the trips are more expensive. How much do you want people to know it's an option? There's all kinds of questions that get embedded in it. But I think the example that Katie used is kind of a perfect example of how when the data producers and the data consumers have that shared vision, when like their clients want the same thing, it is really a lot easier for us to have that happen more quickly than a kind of a top-down process that doesn't take that into account as much.
I can grab a couple of questions from the audience if you guys want to keep throwing questions in there. There's a few good ones in there, so I'll try and bundle a couple together about public agencies that are trying to procure MaaS. So questions from two directions. I've got Sanathan asking for agencies that want to push out its own app, because the agency is concerned about quote unquote owning the data. How can the industry ensure the transit agencies have access to the data they need for planning purposes, regardless of which tech provider they're using? So if they go that route. And related question from someone who stays anonymous, if people are buying these MaaS solutions, which I think maybe my recommendation would be that they might not, but you guys could disagree. If someone is following that path, what are some known pitfalls and how might they avoid them? So I don't know, Bomi or anybody else, if you want to weigh in on, if transit agencies come or public agencies come and they want to buy MaaS, what would you tell them?
So one thing that I would say is, well, first of all, with their existing providers, be very wary and specific about exclusivity, not just exclusivity as a whole in terms of using a specific vendor, but even exclusivity as to where discounted fares may apply, or how specific features can be rolled out. This is where sometimes, even with the intention of adding a MaaS offering, we run into challenges with agencies they're already constrained by existing agreements, and generally I think exclusivity isn't really ever in the interest of the rider, and especially riders' evolving needs. So that's one thing to sort of be wary of. And then as far as something to seek and do, it is to be comfortable with compromising and iterating in partnership with providers like Token Transit. So one example, I have an example agency, Jacksonville Transit Authority over in Florida. So JTA procured and built their own white label app. Then they noted there was an equity and payment gap. I think it was 8% of riders in their service area are underbanked. So they wanted to further their efforts to digitize cash with these underserved populations. But the the vendor they were working with, their kind of goals diverged there, and they decided to work more closely with Token Transit and build these solutions. Here is where the collaborative approach comes in. Our project champion challenged us to take the send a pass, pass program functionality that our platform has, and adapt it to a cash to pass type of portal where third parties can take in physical cash in exchange, offer a digital pass. And it rolled out fairly quickly within a month or so, because they were comfortable with rolling out something that's an MVP and iterating with us. And this is somewhat of a different approach to the customary, there is an RFP, they spec out exactly what they want, the vendor hands it to them and walks away, and it comes back 5-10 years later. So it's kind of a difference in operating that requires a little bit more flexibility and compromise up front, but with the benefit of scale and iteration kind of in faster and over the long term.
Anyone else advice for cities? Joe, sorry, go ahead, Pami.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add that as a result of JTA challenging us to build this feature, we're now rolling it out with other agencies, right? And that's kind of the benefit of that single unified platform.
I wanted to just briefly speak to the data question, because that's a really good question, I think, about sort of owning the data and the type of data that transit agencies need for planning purposes and stuff. And I think there's two things to think about here. The first is sort of the differences sometimes between the type of data that would be used for planning purposes and the type of data that goes into a data specification that is used for surfacing the availability of a service for a user. So the classic example is the difference between Gbfs data, which is for a MaaS application shows when the bikes and scooters are available to be ridden and where they are so that someone can find them and ride them, versus MDS data, the mobility data specification, which has, it tends to be more used for planning purposes and, direct communication between a city and the micromobility provider. So sometimes we're just kind of talking about different data, but then, I think another part of your question is, if you're working with a MaaS provider that's integrating all this data, there's also data that comes out of that application, like transit, about what types of trips people are taking that can be really useful for planning purposes, and definitely a good idea to make that very clear about what your hopes and dreams are for accessing that data. I know we love to work with transit agencies to share data in safe ways to help agencies answer these questions as well. So, but I think there are ways to do that without necessarily needing to procure from scratch your entire app.
Okay, I've got a question I'm going to go to from the Q&A. That is from Elliot McFadden at Minnesota DOT, who maybe some of you know. And I think, I'll frame his question as, kind of pouring a little cold water over the idea that we're in the midst of some great acceleration of mobility options, right? I think he's asking, if Uber and Lyft are still trying to find profitability, and public transit has been here for a while, certainly as a publicly subsidized service in the United States. So, aren't the underdogs really the new guys? And, I take the question one step further and say, should we assume that, people getting around in urban transport is going to mostly be publicly procured? I think that's, for me, kind of the core of the question is, are we trying to wrangle a bunch of new providers who, in some extent can write their own rules because they're operating directly with their consumers and aren't relying on public subsidy, which is at least for now the case of Uber and Lyft? Or is the world going to sort of revert to what it was, a few years ago? Even in the bike and scooter space, we've seen some of that reversion a little bit, where there are more systems that are kind of going back to being, a sole operator, rather than maybe having a whole competing fleet of different scooter companies. So I don't know, this is a bit outside of the core questions around data standards. We've been getting in deep, but are we in the midst of a revolution where we're going to see more and different operators operating for profit and we're having to wrangle them and connect them? Or are we going to kind of see a slow reversion to things looking more like transit, where ultimately, government money is controlling how those services look? And that's open, obviously, to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, I think we often underestimate how many like private operators actually exist out there. I mean, there's, I'm sure we can all think of a number on the top of our head, kind of, top of our head in the city that we live in, beyond just public transit. So I don't think that necessarily, obviously, the big ride-hail TNCs have a monopoly on getting around. We also, the personally owned vehicles are still the vast majority of trips that we're seeing. So I think over the next many years here, or the next few years potentially, we're going to see probably one of the bigger shifts in mobility that's happened maybe in the last 100 years is my opinion. But and I think that the way that I see the world moving is really more towards these enabled, potentially smaller types of mobility providers, and smaller or even maybe monopolized like transit mobility providers, and having them really maybe live alongside the larger monolithic companies that might exist in the TNC space.
Were you hinting at autonomous vehicles, Josh, or just talking about the kind of things we're seeing today?
I mean, I do think that I maybe not in the majority in thinking that autonomous vehicles will make a big splash here pretty soon. But yeah, I also think that even with mobile phones, like we've seen, having a phone that has access to the internet has actually transformed the way that we experience transportation, whether that's public transportation or if it's something like a TNC. I think that it's actually pretty dramatically changed that, and I think that in itself has propelled forward this a pretty big shift in the way that we get around.
Others want to weigh in. Are we going to see a future of transit that looks like public transportation, or sort of the Uber and Lyft world? And what does that mean for all the things we're talking about around mobility as a service?
Can I throw out one more complication to that question?
Absolutely. Or answer it yourself, Anthony.
Where do Uber and Lyft end up? If they are sort of in, I think Tim O'Reilly called it a capital fueled death match. Is there going to be one? Are they going to be subsumed by Google and Apple and Amazon? Are they just going to evaporate? What opportunities and challenges does that create to openness?
I think Didi comes in and destroys all of it.
I think that services or private services like Uber and Lyft and kind of their consumer-driven iteration on transit help public transit in many ways. For example, pushing transit to move to more of a pay-per-trip model. I think in some ways encouraging public transit to adopt things like fare capping, so that more and more riders can be in a pay-per-trip model. That it's a great thing to that they exist to challenge public transit in that way. But ultimately, I think that the city should always be in the center and kind of controlling that total ecosystem, where public and private are playing together and supporting riders together, but with central accounts. Like when a rider has one account for transit, that allows features like fare capping and multimodal trips to happen without a rider logging in and out of Uber in order to log in and out of Lime or in a transit app. All of these things, I think the city really has to sit at the center and control the subsidies and the regulations for riders to ride with both.
We've entered the last 4 minutes of our panel, so this is the more speculative phase. So Heidi posits that DD will conquer everything, which I think is it's a good one. We can come back and revisit that. I don't think it's the worst prediction in the world in terms of probabilities. Anybody else want to weigh in on, are we heading to a future of, I think it is an important question for all these things, right? If you think we're going to go back to a world where everything is publicly subsidized, or everything that is not the personal car, which is subsidized in different ways, but not kind of directly in an operational sense. If we're heading that way, I think it has different implications for everything we're talking about. So, while I recognize it's a bit speculative, I do think it's important. I think there are a lot of people, and Elliot's question, I think probably he would argue, is indicative of a lot of people's belief that we're living through a kind of temporary period of, venture-fueled experimentation in transportation that's going to go away. I'm curious. Anybody else want to weigh in on whether that's just a passing fad and we'll all be back to publicly subsidized world and integration? I think in that world, integration is probably easier to mandate than the other one. But yeah, Heidi, go ahead. More on DD taking over.
No more on that. I think, one of the things that I feel like I started to see, at least before the pandemic, was more of a return to something closer to the docked bike share model. So I love the docked bike share model, and then it kind of started to go away. And because it is onerous, the work with the cities, placing the stations, I mean, it's such a heavy lift, but that heavy lift gets it higher public subsidies. It has a completely different relationship to the city. And I thought we were kind of moving more in that direction as more and more cities and the non-shared mobility public being annoyed by stuff being parked everywhere, and they would just put it in a dock. And then I'm not sure if that's the direction we're still going in, but I think if we do, that creates a really different relationship with the cities, and it has to be a more cooperative and collaborative relationship. And then the city has to kind of think about it as public transit in a different way. And I think with enough operators pulling out during the pandemic and cities kind of seeing what that meant when they weren't invested as public transit, that's possible that we get to head in that direction. And I hope so.
Great. I think I can have maybe one more question, unless somebody wants to weigh in on the future, on whether we're all going to go back to being publicly subsidized or not. I think the docked bike share versus not docked is a really good kind of microcosm of that whole debate. There was one more question in the Q&A, which maybe I can use to sort of wrap things up. But this bit about subscriptions, right? Everybody's talked about, mobility as a service really in some people's mind is Netflix, and we pay one price and we get all this bundle of things. Is that just a thing we should stop talking about, or is that going to happen in some ways, and how important are subscriptions, if at all? So lightning round answers, if you have a quick idea. Important, yes or no? Don't care a lot, going to change the world, not going to matter, never going to happen?
I think important, cool, impossible until we get some of these prerequisites of getting everything in the same place and purchasable to happen. So that is where my energy has been focused, but it's not because I don't think those types of models are really exciting and hopefully a direction we're headed in.
Excellent. Very succinct, Katie, too. Appreciate it. I think we're coming up on time. I have a couple things I want to say. I think one is, if you're interested in this topic, I will shamelessly plug that Transit is releasing a report next Tuesday, which highlights a lot of the work that people on this call are actually doing, and talks about how we can do the open version of this. And we're having a webinar on that next Tuesday, which if you look for it, we can find it on the web. And I think, Anthony, we are having another session in the kind of Cornell Tech series on this topic happening in the fall with dates TBD still, but kind of teasing at these topics a little more.
Yeah, the plan is to do something at Commotion LA in November, and I think we're hoping to dive a little deeper into Gofs.
Yeah, which came up a couple times on this call, which is great. And I'm being reminded by the organizers of the conference that if you want, there is an event currently ongoing about why women matter in mobility innovation, presented by ITS America as part of Commotion Miami. So if you want to tune to that, it's happening now. And Katie nicely put the link to our webinar in the chat, which I appreciate. So I really want to thank all the panelists for being here. I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks Cornell Tech for inviting us and Commotion Miami for having us. And thanks for being on the call if you're an attendee, and we have lots of great questions. So appreciate that too. So I think we can end it. I can click the end button. This is great. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.